Well, I can't get to it, so I'm going to
I'm
suggest
going to mute myself.
that we get started. Hi, everybody. If you were expecting to see John Bloomfield's charming face, don't panic. This is the Audubon meeting. You haven't turned into the wrong Zoom meeting. I'm Kay Grinnell. I'm one of your Audubon board members. And since John and Marina are traveling, I have the honor of introducing our speaker this afternoon. Just a note, this is going to be an informal discussion. So if you are now muted, if you would like to ask a question, remember to find that mute button on the bottom left of your screen and unmute yourself to ask your question. Otherwise, if everyone just keeps talking, it's because you were talking while on mute. Okay. If you've been around the Lowcountry for a while, you've probably met Ernie Wiggers and perhaps had the opportunity to hear him speak. Dr. Ernie Wiggers started his work as president and CEO of the Nemours Wildlife Foundation 22 years ago. He and his staff at Nemours conduct research, and they often team with various agencies or universities to learn more about our wildlife and the rich natural resources we enjoy. Today, Dr. Wiggers will discuss our historic rice fields and their use in wildlife conservation. And as a bonus, we'll get to hear about what's going on at Nemours. Dr. Wiggers, take it away.
Thank you, Kay. Really a pleasure to be here and see everyone. I hope if you have heard me talk, it won't be too much of a repeat, but still, some of this information I think is so important for people to hear, particularly about some of the history of the Lowcountry and how that history now is kind of converged with conservation efforts. And it makes for what, I guess I'm biased, but it really makes for a very interesting subject matter when you sit down and think about all the things that came together to make this happen. So I'll talk about our foundation towards the end. I want to get more into talking about the kind of the regions we live in. One quick point here, I forgot about this slide. Foundation was established by Eugene DuPont III, who passed in 1995, but he assembled about 10,000 acres here in northern Beaufort County, which he called Nemours Plantation. And credit to him, because he was an avid outdoorsman, hunter and fisherman. He left all of that land in his as a 501c3 for the benefit of wildlife. Really, that's what he left it for wildlife. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we've been doing with the land and the foundation as we get to the end of the presentation. Here's kind of a Google scene of most of the Lowcountry in this region, maybe not down quite capturing Palmetto Bluff. I know where that's at, but just to give you some landmarks, the air station at Beaufort, Gardens Corner, where Highway 17 and 21 intersect. This is the Combahee River coming down through here. This is the A in the Ace Basin, the Ashepoo River, and the Edisto River. So that AC East is the Combahee, Ashepoo, Edisto River basins draining into the St. Helena Sound. And this is where we reside at here. Now I've lost there we go, my pointer. Here we are at Nemours, touching up against Highway 21, Highway 17 kind of splits us. The big signatures here are landmarks of these two big bends in the river, one on kind of the west side of 17 and one on the east side of 17 as you cross the river. It's hard to talk about this area and region without talking about what happened really 200-300 years ago now, because it left a footprint here, a footprint that we still recognize and actually we still utilize. But this was the turning of the transformation of this landscape into an agricultural landscape, primarily for the purpose of producing rice, Carolina gold. And it was gold in many ways, and it made plantation owners fairly wealthy. In fact, Charleston was one of the centers of wealth in the early periods of the United States. But all of this, of course, was done on the backs of enslaved people. And as I go through here, one point I want to make is not to forget, one, the tremendous effort it took for these enslaved people to transform this landscape into an agricultural landscape. But also, I hate to say the word accomplishment, but that transformation was truly phenomenal. And again, we utilize a lot of that infrastructure today in some of the things we do towards land conservation, which is a fairly remarkable story from my perspective as well. As we look back on these maps, and again, this is that one big bend in the river right above Highway 17. This is 17 going north to Charleston, and the bridge right here, the Harriet Tubman Bridge now. This is part of Nemours. Some of this up through here is the refuge and other places. But the river here, but you see all of these other, what looks like field plots now, agricultural plots. These were the old rice fields. These were developed starting back in the late 1600s and through the 17 and 1800s. It first started in what we called inland rice fields, which were more the inland creeks and drainages and swamps, where they removed the trees, put in some dike structure, and then for water, they depended upon rainfall and runoff to flood their fields and grow their rice. This was productive in the 1600s and into the early 1700s, but it was limited in scope because you were depending upon rainwater. And if you had any kind of drought cycles and so forth, your rice production could go down. Also, you were limited kind of geographically. You notice these were long linear fields following the drainages of these streams and swamps and so forth. Eventually, starting in the mid 1750s, they started coming down to the river's edge and capturing some of this tidal marshland. So although we're 8 to 10 miles further than that, river miles from the river, the Combahee River here has a difference in tidal amplitude of 4 to 6 feet, maybe even 7 or 8 feet today with some of the tides we have. So that on high tide, these marshes close to the river will flood, and at low tides, they will drain. And we're so far away from the St. Helena Sound, for the majority of time, particularly back then, the Combahee River, the Edisto, and these other associated rivers were fresh water. So they were fresh water, but tidals, which made it ideal for growing rice. They could flood their fields with fresh water or drain the water as necessary. But they were not so limited in water back then as they were with these inland fields. So tidal rice fields, we'll talk about tidal rice fields and the inland rice fields. Both of them very important to the rice industry, and that landscape and that feature, as you can see, is fairly widespread. You can see down here on either side of the river, these are old rice fields because you can see the straight lines of some of the canals and dikes in here. Nature doesn't do anything in straight lines. I've seldom see straight lines in nature. When you see straight lines, it's probably because humans had something to do with it. We prefer straight lines, it seems. And here's that same wetland area today here, the Combahee River coming by, looping around. This river up here is around 20 feet deep, 20 to 25 feet deep, and several hundred feet wide. So it's not just a small, drainage. It's a pretty significant body of water. First thing they had to do, was that a question? Someone ask a question?
We started to get a little echo from your presentation.
For mine?
Yeah, it was a bit of a feedback kind of sound.
Some
Okay.
people are not muted, so you might mute everybody.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. But let me know. I don't know what I can do to change things here, but
You sound okay now.
all right.
Okay.
So the first thing the enslaved had to do was put a barrier up between the river and the marshland. We call these the perimeter dikes. And you can see where the dirt came from to make that dike here. These are the canals, the perimeter canals. And again, keep in mind, this river is up to 20 feet deep in places and several hundred feet wide. And all of this was done by hand, maybe with donkeys, mules, horses, but there was no machinery at this time. We're talking the mid 1700s. So this was all hand labor. And even once this perimeter dike was put in, then they had to come into this large area and they divided it up into smaller fields. And one of the purposes of dividing into smaller fields is, although this looks pretty flat and level to us, there are slight elevational differences in this area, and they wanted their fields to be as level as possible so that when they went to put 2 inches of water on their rice, it was 2 inches of water across the entire field, not 4 inches in one area and a half an inch in the other area. So leveling this out and making it into a level surface was very important to them. But you begin to see here within this field were a number of other smaller dikes and canals for the purpose of moving water and for dividing this up into uniform fields. These little faint lines coming through here are ditches, which they called quarter drains, and it helped move water onto the field when they flooded it and helped move water away when they wanted to drain it. The farming, the rice growing went in, happened on the land in between each of these quarter drains, which are about 30 yards, 90 feet apart or so here. And and that was called the task, where they actually grew rice at.
Do you have any idea what the number of slaves were that worked on this project at one time?
Yeah, that's asked a lot. And I know here in Newport, where this was at, there were several hundred slaves involved in just Newport here. This is about 475 acres. But each year for planting rice, because they planted seeds for rice, they had to come out here and completely cultivate that ground in early spring, February and March, and put the seeds in the ground and then cover the seeds over with dirt. So it's a tremendous amount of labor each year to both plant, grow, and harvest that rice. As we look at some of these fields today, it's easy for us to say, yeah, I could see how we could go in there and start farming. It wouldn't take too much effort. But in reality, these are what most of these freshwater marshes look like. They were mature, old growth cypress forest. And as we dig around and do things in these wetlands, in these old historic rice fields today, we encounter a lot of woody debris, indicating to me and a lot of people that yes, these were wooded forest at one time. So again, think about all that had to happen, and it was all done by hand. And another kind of shot at this landscape here, this one wetland here, and all of this treeless area back through here were all part of historic rice fields. Today, we call them managed tidal impoundments. But to look at this again, as I told you, first thing had to happen was a perimeter dike, and for 475 acres, that was almost 4 miles of just a perimeter dike. Then there's multiple miles inside there of other dikes, canals, quarter drains, etc. So again, trying to get back to the scope of what had to happen on this landscape to make this happen. One of the things we've always been curious about is how much of the coastline of South Carolina was put into rice. Rice, they did grow rice in North Carolina. It went down through Georgia and maybe into Florida down to around the Jacksonville area. But South Carolina was the center of it by far. The acreages were much greater in South Carolina than any of the other states. And some of the old writings, people had speculated, because they didn't have maps and things to go by, that it was 150,000 acres, maybe 170,000 acres. But we started talking with some people, and we've got graduate students involved and Clemson University involved and people with GIS mapping capabilities involved, LIDAR, infrared, all of those things. And we, over the past several years, have made an effort to try and map all the old rice fields along the South Carolina coast. And we've come up with almost 236,000 acres. The yellow or light green color you see here are the inland rice fields. The blue are existing active tidal rice fields, and the red is the broken rice field, tidal rice fields that are no longer functional. And I'll do a close-up now, but you can see it reaching down through here. Kind of a big gap down in y'all's area, because as you drive down Highway 170 from Beaufort to Bluffton, you'll note there those marshes are very shallow next to the river water, and they flood each day with and close to the ocean. So those were too salty there, didn't have the fresh water capability that we had up here in the Ace Basin, around Charleston with the Ashley River, and up here in the Santee Delta with the freshwater rivers flowing into there. If we look at the Ace Basin a little bit closer, you begin to appreciate what a spider web kind of interconnected rice fields there were. Again, the blue here, you can see our two impoundments, they're still intact and manageable. These are other private landowners and some of the refuge. The red is broken tidal rice fields. And then all of this was the inland rice fields that really stretch up to I-95 or close to it in most areas. And you begin to get a real appreciation for just how much of the landscape was modified back in the day by hand. So then, you know, with Civil War coming on in the 1860s, a lot of these rice fields were abandoned because of the war. The rice fields were focal point for the Union soldiers to destroy some of the infrastructure. And after the Civil War, there was a lot of economic stress in this region that used to be very wealthy. And plantation owners started leaving this area because there was so much destruction to some of that infrastructure, and they lost their number one commodity, and that was free labor. Now, they tried to do some sharecropping and other things, and rice farming held on until the 1920s. But a couple of other things were happening besides this economic stress going on in this part of the world. Rice started showing up in the Mississippi River Valley. They started growing rice there. Obviously, with the Mississippi River, they had plenty of fresh water, and the infrastructure that didn't require the same amount and scope of the infrastructure that was required here along our coastal area. So they started losing the market for rice. And then also, the one thing that scared rice farmers more than anything, and just like for us today, are tropical storms. Storms that would push salt water up these rivers, a wedge of salt water, into their rice fields, destroying the capability of those rice fields to produce rice the next year. And we started into having a high frequency of those storms, starting with the 1893 storm that essentially wiped out Beaufort. And then there were several more storms after that. So by really 1920, 1925, it was over. Rice farming was over. But we had these huge plantations here in the Lowcountry, and we had this infrastructure that was built for rice farming. So the question is, what's going to happen? We're at a crossroads here now in the 1920s. What's going to occur here? We could just walk away from it Is some other farming operation going to take over, or what might happen? And the one thing in the short sentence would be ducks happen, waterfowl, wildlife happen. Keeping in mind the time of the country now, we're in the 1920s. Recreational sport hunting was a very big family activity. A much higher percentage of the population did this than probably does it today. It was a social event. And these large plantations, you can just begin to imagine with all this rice being produced, hand harvested, and seed falling on the ground from the rice production and harvesting, the attraction that had for migratory birds like waterfowl coming to these wetland areas and having this abundance of seed here and food here. And it attracted lots of other birds too. And then you had deer and you had quail and other things to hunt. So people who did have wealth, particularly from up north, whether it was DuPonts or other wealthy people, began buying up these properties because they were very cheap, and not to use them for farming operations, but to use them for recreational purposes. So that was what happened with most of these properties. So it kept these properties in large ownership patterns instead of getting split up, divided up, made into small units. Most of these properties were retained in large land holdings, which is going to be important for my next slide here. And a lot of this is captured in several different books, the most recent one being this book, Rice and Ducks by Virginia Beach, The Convergence that Saved the Carolina Lowcountry. And what that talks about in there, this next slide, particularly focus on the light green and dark green areas. These are lands in the Ace Basin that have been protected. The dark green lands are state and federal properties, public properties. The light green lands are properties that private citizens have put conservation easements on and are protected through the easement, protected from development. They can still be farmed, you can grow timber on them, you can hunt them. It's just a very strict limit on number of buildings that can be built, roads that can be built, and so forth to keep commercial development out. So a lot of that was made possible because with one signature, somebody could have protected 3,000 acres of land, 5,000 acres of land, and in some cases over 10,000 acres of land just with one signature. So we weren't just saving post stamp kind of areas of land. The Ace Basin conservation effort and in the late 1980s, and their goal was to protect 90,000 acres. And now today, they're on the 30th anniversary we celebrated last year, a year ago, it's over 300,000 acres of protected land in the Ace Basin. So that's a tremendous conservation story. That's really, the Ace Basin effort is known nationally and even internationally because it's a great example of how to conserve an entire landscape. So that's one of the things that has come out of this that goes back to the rice farming of 200 or 300 years ago. What does that mean for conservation? Well, we can start with our national symbol. Most of you remember in the 70s, 60s and 70s, we were concerned whether our national symbol, the bald eagle, was going to be around for another generation. It was fast disappearing. People were still shooting and hunting bald eagles, and the bald eagle was being impacted by DDT and other pesticides being put into the environment. So there's a tremendous amount of concern about the decline in our national symbol. Same thing to do with the American alligator. So in 1977, states began doing surveys to try to determine how many nesting bald eagles do we have in the lower 48 states. Georgia did surveys and they came up with 0. North Carolina did surveys, they came up with 0. South Carolina counted 13 nests, 12 of which occurred in the Lowcountry on what were historic rice fields. So those rice fields, today's impoundments, had a big role to play in the fact that we still had nesting bald eagles in South Carolina along the coast. And one of the reasons was those impoundments attracted large numbers of waterfowl and other birds, which did not concentrate DDT to the extent that fish do, which is a major food component of bald eagles. And these birds then could feed, the eagles could feed on these other birds and not get the same concentration of pesticides in their diet. So it allowed them to hang on. We had 2 of these nests, a 1977 nest here on Nemours. One is actually still active today. Our biologist and intern went out a few days ago to check our eagle's nest. And in fact, that nest has a pair using it again this year. In South Carolina, we're over 400, probably over 450 nests, moving towards 500 nests. In fact, some people are wondering if the eagles haven't started to occupy all of the kind of the priority best nesting sites for them across the state. So it's been a very good success story. The same thing with American alligators. These impoundments, these wetlands served as refuges for these alligators where they could still hang on, maybe in low numbers, but it still existed here in the state, even as they went on the endangered species list.
We just had our, like everybody, Christmas bird count. And Susan, do you remember what our eagle count was for this year? I think it was in the low 50s.
Wow. Wow. That's great. And it's always nice to see them
It was
flying around.
52.
There we go.
They're starting to nest. They should all be on nests now. So that's great to hear. Along with that, as time has gone on, not only the resident birds that we have, but other birds have began to find these productive wetlands. The wood storks weren't here until the early 1970s. Before that, they were down south of us in Florida and beyond. So they're a recent addition here. And now they nest here, in rookeries of several thousand. Roseate spoonbills over here. These birds have just started to show in the last 10 or 15 years, starting to see them more and more here year round. It used to be that it seemed like they kind of disappeared in the wintertime. And last year, the state is recorded one of their first known nest of roseate spoonbill. So they're beginning to nest here now, which is great. The black-bellied whistling duck, y'all probably have some of those too. They again came from around the Gulf Coast region, moved up from Florida, and are now occupying our wetland habitats. And I don't know if you see these down around Palmetto Bluff or not, or Hilton Head, but white pelicans. These are birds from our Midland, comes from the interior part of the United States, west of the Mississippi River. They come here, stay here. They do go back and breed and nest, is my understanding, but continue to occupy this area here. And we've been seeing nice flocks of them the last few weeks on some of our impoundments. So we're adding birds to our list that utilize this area. And one of the things here from that land, from the prior history, the dikes we have rebuilt. They're much bigger than they probably were when they could only be made by hand, but we've added on to them and maintained those dikes. And we still use this iconic structure of South Carolina, the rice trunk. And it's a simple structure made out of wood, and you have to go there like this man is doing here and lifting the door up so that you can either drain water or flood your fields. But it works off of the tide. So at high tides, you open a door and you can move water into your field. At low tide, you open another door and you can move water off of your field. It works off of gravity and it works off of tides, things that are very consistent and constant. So It's hard to beat. Its simplicity is what makes it such a really engineering marvel. And it has gone through some evolutions from the times when it was first used back in the 1750s, but it's still something that we still build and use today, just like they did over 200 years ago. Pretty remarkable structures, really. And yes, we can still attract tremendous numbers of waterfowl to these areas. And waterfowl are kind of the driving force because it is what landowners are willing to invest money for so that they can have these waterfowl numbers and enjoy recreational hunting still today. So that's still very important because that's one of the values that these wetlands have. And you can see scenes like this. I think Gadwall here tilting over on one of our ponds and feeding in one of our managed impoundment. But along with that, with these good quality wetlands, you can also see scenes like this. Tremendous number of wading birds coming to these impoundments to forage in because there's all kind of forage resources being produced in these ponds during the year. Small fish, small crustaceans, snails, everything that different types and groups of birds can feed on. So it's not uncommon to see these kind of flocks occupying these areas, particularly when you start to drain water off of these areas. And if you drain water and manage that water carefully, you start attracting these several dozen species of shorebirds that can come into these impoundments and forage here as well. But water management is the key, and it goes back to that simple water control structure that I showed a few slides back. Being able to manipulate the water to grow the forages during the growing season and then create the right water levels so that the different bird species can utilize these impoundments. If we add 2 inches of water to this impoundment here, most of the birds you see here would be gone. That food would be there, but that would be inaccessible to them because it's too deep. So that's kind of the information we try to put out to landowners and to people. We can have waterfowl, but you can have a whole lot more without impacting your ability to produce habitat for waterfowl. And that's a very important story that comes out of some of the research we're helping with. So this gets into what do we do here in the foundation: stewardship, research, and education. As I said, we manage these 10,000 acres primarily to support various species of wildlife that we would expect to see here on the coast. And in research, we do some of our own work. I have a biologist here, Bo Bauer, and we also work a lot with different partners, particularly universities, where we can involve graduate students, undergraduate students, bright young people who can help us gather the data and analyze these data and help us on some of these questions that we have. One of the projects we're working on now deals with alligators. Not alligators where we would typically think of alligators living in swamps and rivers, but alligators more typical of some of the communities you live in. In fact, Sea Pines is one of the communities we're working on. These alligators have been around people. If you look at some of these communities, been around for 30 or 40 years. They are so accustomed to people that you can walk close up to them without this major predator fleeing from us. They really, from my perspective, not too interested in two-legged creatures at all. But sometimes we get too close to them, or we do things that bring us into too close a proximity, and bad things can happen because they're very large, powerful animals. But one of the things we're doing is putting transmitters on these animals so that we can look at their movements. This is Bowen, one of our interns, on a 12-foot plus animal here with a satellite tracking device. We're on these animals, holding them for their protection and our protection. This animal has not been sedated. It was captured. It kind of wore itself out during the fight of capture. And now we're just trying to secure it it takes about 10 minutes to put this transmitter on them so that we can begin getting this kind of information. The pink is the female we captured and the blue is a male, and start looking at their movements. How are they utilizing these urban landscapes, and where all do they move to, and what types of habitats do we generally find them in? The other thing we're looking at deals more with behavior. Through some prior work to a colleague of ours, he noted that once these alligators were captured like this, live captured, and then released safely and unharmed, that it did have an impact on their behavior, and that their flight distance, that distance they would allow a two-legged creature get to them, changed and it increased. So instead of allowing, that this animal sun basking up on the golf course and you walking up to within 4 or 5 feet of it, which we have literally done, after capture, that distance may be 10, 15, 20, or 25 feet that you can get within it before it moves off the bank and back into the water. So maybe there are some behavioral modifications that can be done that help keep people and alligators a little more separated. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the chance of being injured by an alligator is going to ever go to zero. As long as there are people and alligators, there's always that chance and opportunity. But some of this work could lead us to better understanding how we can keep that separation so that they can be safe and we can be safe at the same time. So that's where some of this work is going. We're working with Clemson University and a PhD student up there on some of those topics. I mentioned the black-bellied whistling duck. They are a cavity nesting duck, and yes, they will use wood duck boxes. Wood ducks, the boxes we put up for our native wood duck species. So one of the things there, as black-bellied whistling ducks became more common, was what is the competition here for these wood duck boxes? The state and private citizens are investing money in putting up wood duck boxes, but what if they instead are being utilized by black-bellied whistling ducks? We had a graduate student work on this and some other issues around this topic, but this graph, the red line shows when nesting occurs for wood ducks and when nesting occurs for the black-bellied whistling ducks. And they're really kind of out of sync. Wood ducks are starting to nest now. It wouldn't surprise me to know that there's some eggs in wood duck boxes now, but definitely in the next few weeks, we're going to start seeing eggs in wood duck boxes, with incubation really peaking out in late March and early April. And then there's another little bump, probably from wood ducks that failed in nesting the first go around, trying to nest out in May and June, and maybe a little bit into July. But black-bellied whistling ducks really don't get going until summertime, and they're starting to peak out in June and July. So the nesting cycles are a little bit different, and which means there shouldn't be a lot of competition at the times when whistling ducks are starting to nest. That may change as the abundance of whistling ducks change. It'll be something we need to keep an eye on. We're also with wood ducks, because of concerns by state agencies and others about the wood duck boxes. There's still questions about is the net gain from these boxes in terms of the overall population for wood ducks. So we've become involved in a multi-state project looking at particularly recruitment of ducks into these wood duck boxes and seeing if it has an overall population effect. So this project is going on in several states. I'll show a map in a minute. We're banding young chicks before they leave the box, and then following up in successive years to determine how many of those young chicks actually come back and try to nest again, called recruitment. And it's really important to the population metrics that we have a high proportion of young ducks coming back trying to add to the population. And that hasn't really been looked at before in all the work that has been done with wood ducks. And so that's what this team of students and technicians are doing across several states.
We're also, of course, finding out some of these other issues dealing with predation and things like that, and looking further at how do we try to minimize some of these issues that come up. But these are the states we're working in. We're working with cooperators in Delaware and Maryland. We have study sites in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, all the way over to Louisiana, and even a cooperator up in Wisconsin participating in this. So it's kind of it's a very unique that it's multiple states, multiple organizations, and our biologist, Bo Bauer, is the coordinator of all of this going on. Other work we do here dealing with wetlands, we're looking at this forage resource that is produced there, both plant material and the small animal, invertebrates, snail material that provides a lot of protein and calcium for birds. This is what waterfowl come down for. This is what wading birds and shorebirds are coming in for. And we need to have a better understanding of how management of these impoundments affect this forage resource. We're not only looking at just birds in these cases. We've had a graduate student look at mammalian predators and their use of these impoundments. We commonly see bobcats, tracks on our dikes, and tracks of other animals, including coyotes and river otters. You can see up here, this bobcat has a small mouse or some kind of rodent in it. On these trail camera photos, in almost all instances, we'll notice that these cats, their fur is wet, indicating they've been in the water, they've been looking for prey, they've really been working the edges of these dikes to find small mammals and even small birds and other things to feed on, snakes or whatever. This was a very interesting photo we captured. I don't know if you can make this out, but this is a cat that has about a 3-foot alligator in its mouth. So here's one predator taking another predator. We'd heard people comment about that before, but this was the first time we actually got a photo evidence of that happening. And then also get a lot of activity of river otters in our wetlands. So she's been looking at food habits of these animals, trying to categorize when they use these impoundments and what types of foods they're taking. We're doing work in the uplands to create and refurbish some of our upland habitats, longleaf pine, the use of prescribed burning, because fire was such a dominant part of the natural ecosystems in the southeastern states. Maybe as frequently as every 3 to 4 years, a fire naturally burned through our upland woodlands. So we're trying to mimic that, create these nice open pine savannas that are very diverse in the understory with different grasses and plant materials. But along with that, opening up the canopy and that diverse understory, we get some of our more uncommon animals like southern fox squirrels, the red-cockaded woodpecker, which was extirpated in the Ace Basin, but now we've helped bring those back to Nemours and to other private properties and public properties. Other bird species that are a little more uncommon, like loggerhead shrikes, and even some things we might not put high on our particular list, but things like eastern diamondback rattlesnakes. And then with this eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, through our studies in southern fox squirrels, here's one snake, and that's one of our southern fox squirrels. So we learned the hard way some of the things that these eastern diamondback rattlesnakes like to forage on. And under stewardship, all of this infrastructure we have to maintain. The rice trunks, the water control structures, they last about 25 years before they begin to fall apart and have to be replaced. So there's just a constant need to upgrade this infrastructure. This is what one of those trunks looked like before going in under the dike. They're about 30 to 35 feet long, 5 feet wide. And again, really just simple marvel engineering machines. But it takes a lot of big equipment to work on these dikes and maintain this infrastructure. The other part of what we do is education. We really enjoy, I do, especially working with young kids, school groups, bringing them out, showing them some things about nature, and maybe just trying to pique their interest. We like to call it taking the kids for a walk in the woods. So many kids today don't get a chance to do that very often, but we can go out and show them some interesting things. And again, pique their interest in what's just outside their back door, and hopefully maybe get them conscious and thinking about conservation as they grow up. The other thing that I'm proud of that we do, and we kind of just say helping students get their feet muddy, is these graduate students we bring down here and other young intern students. This is some of the first times they've actually gotten out in the mud, holding a drip torch, doing prescribed burns. They get wonderful instructions in the ivory towers through faculty and those kinds of things. But you gotta, get out and apply that to truly appreciate how it's used and why it's important. So giving these students this opportunity to gain that kind of hands-on experience, I think is something very important that we do. And I'm very appreciative of these opportunities. You get to see these young people really grow and kind of bloom and really get excited about the profession that they've selected to be in. And so these kind of things is really nice. So that kind of is a brief summary of what we do here. Some of the things we're doing. And one of the more important things I will also say is not just the natural resources, but the partnerships of all the different groups we can work together with down here for conservation purposes. And I know a lot of you are in Audubon, and we're working with them closely now on a project where we want to do some things across the state of South Carolina focused on bird migration and bird ecology, which I think you'll be hearing about in this coming year and the next year. So we're trying to bring together these organizations and take some of this effort across the state, particularly focused again on engaging young people and other citizens in learning about birds, getting them excited through birds, and from that excited into conservation in general. All of this goes back to, again, the Ace Basin area here, the three rivers. Back in the 1990s, the Nature Conservancy classified this as one of the last great places on Earth. And that's what we're hoping through our efforts and working through the partnerships we have and their efforts, that it'll stay one of the last great places on Earth. So that's where I'm at. Question.
Yay.
So some people
Very good. Thank you so much. We're all muted. We're clapping.
Yeah. Did any questions pop up?
Remember, unmute yourself and feel free to jump in and ask a question.
Did anybody write up?
Well, there were some questions about the kinds of birds that are in these habitats, and you answered a lot of that, but some specifically asking about black rails.
Black rails. That's the big bird now. Well, it's not big bird, but yeah. Actually, we've taken an active role with black rails. We have actually set aside and dedicated some of our impoundments to black rail management. We did not encounter any this past summer, but we're still working on that, and hopefully this next breeding season we will begin to encounter black rails in these impoundments. We've selected these sites based on the information we know what black rails tend to utilize. I know the biologist over at Bear Island Wildlife Management Area she has done some fabulous work with black rails, and we worked with her. So based on her information, we think we have a chance of, really starting to manage an area and bring black rails to Nemours that way. So we're building it, and we hope they come, that we're still waiting on them to come. Black rails, particularly I think if you go on the DNR website or some of the other sites, you might see some of the video this biologist has produced on black rails, really one of a kind. And we have them here along the South Carolina coast. Again, the majority of them have been detected in these old rice fields, managed impoundments. So it's another one of those things there where we can look to this ancient agricultural landscape and say that is allowing us to, again, manage and have some species that are fairly uncommon. But good. What else?
I took a picture of a beaver on Christmas Day over on 17. Unfortunately, he was dead, but I was just absolutely dumbfounded to see a beaver.
Yep.
I was wondering what the population is over there.
We have had beavers here off and on. There are more beavers up the river from us. Our neighbors have more beavers than we do. We're kind of, seems to be right on the dividing line, 17 here. I don't know the reason for that, to be honest. I used to think it was alligators, but they have alligators up west of us, so upriver from us. So I'm not entirely sure of what causes the beavers to segregate a little bit here. But yes, they are in the Lowcountry, and they can create some havoc because they can build a dam and try to block up water where you don't necessarily want it. But they are here and they are around.
I had a couple of questions. One duck question, or rather one bird question. Where was the roseate spoonbill nesting? And the other had to do with the construction of the perimeter around the rice fields. I'll go to that one first. About how much did they get done in a day? How many feet or yards do you think that they managed to do in a day? That was 4 miles. That's a lot of yards.
It is, particularly thinking about they had to carry that dirt up there and drop it off. The questions come up a lot. How many slaves, what was how many slaves per acre of rice field, or how many acres could it slave? We slowly trying to go back through and try to glean some of that information. We know that some of these plantations would have several hundred enslaved people, but there was a percentage of those that worked in the field. There's a percentage of those that cooked and took care of the houses and things. There are a percentage of those who had to be the craftsmen, the nurses, the healthcare keepers. Some of those were older or injured people who could not work in the fields. So it was an entire community there when you think about it. And really putting a number on how many acres could an individual manage rice field acres, we don't know that answer right now. At least I haven't had anybody give me that answer. I would expect, they can make maybe tens of feet a day, maybe, building this perimeter dike, but I would expect it was a pretty slow process as well.
So you're
Plus,
thinking it took more than a year to probably do that, encircle that one area?
I would think so. And the unfortunate thing for them is in the areas where they didn't have the dike, the water kept coming up at high tide and going out at low tide. So as they would add dirt, and we see this today, even with machines, as you're rebuilding after a break or something like that, you got to get it all done at low tide, because once the water starts washing out or washing in, it's taking your dirt that you just put up there with it. So
It's a frustrating process, and how they actually did all of that, I don't think we fully appreciate, because that's one of the big problems we face today is you need to get in there and plug that hole during the low tide event, because once the water starts coming in, it's going to wash all your dirt away. Good question.
What about the roseate spoonbills? Where are they nesting in South Carolina?
They wouldn't say. They just,
Oh,
the
they give us
biologists would just
a
say we've
secret location.
documented them, so they're keeping it away from us. I think it was in association with some other colony nesting birds, whether it was they found them with some wood stork colonies or not, I'm not sure, or egrets or something like that.
Well, thank you.
I have a question about the alligators. You showed the map of the tracking of the male and the female.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of what that distance is?
Oh, the female tends to be a little more sedentary. Now she went across the marsh into a little, I guess call it an island, but there was a freshwater pond over there, and that's why she hung out so much over there in that little freshwater pond. They're typically, wherever their nest site is, they're going to be within a few hundred yards of that or within that pond. They don't move around great distances. Males can make miles of movements, particularly during the breeding season when they're trying to visit as many females as they can. So they're much more mobile and could move across, an entire community actually.
Okay, thanks.
Are there hours that the Nemours plantation is open, or is it by appointment only?
Yeah, not open to the public, just generally. We just not set up for that. We will have groups out, educational groups or whatever, and give them a presentation and take them on a tour and show them a little bit more about some of the stuff we're doing. We enjoy doing that. It's just a matter, we try to limit that to around 20 people, maybe a little fewer than that now until we get through this virus situation, and offer them an educational experience here when we can. So we can do that. We prefer to do that with groups of 10 to 15 people or something like that, whether it's a whatever group might be. Other questions?
I just had a comment in regard to beaver. I have observed them on Fort Stewart in Georgia.
Oh yeah, yeah. They're plenty around.
Any more questions for Dr. Wiggers?
Thank you.
It's exciting to see all those bird pictures.
Yeah.
No, we were.
I'll tell you
over
what, when when an impoundment is being drawn down, it is amazing how quickly the birds pick up on it. Obviously, first ones are going to be the wading birds, and it just seems like they just instantly know and show up in incredible numbers. It's really impressive to see.
Well, thank you so much for your information about rice fields and conservation and what's going on at Nemours. Anybody have any general Audubon questions or comments? Nice to see you all. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you Audubon members next month.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everybody.
Thank you so much, Ernie.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.